weeks, but I was saying that I started my career in theater very young. I was 2.5 months old, and I played Baby Jesus in the nativity scene outside of my mother's church.
How'd that work out?
I mean, it was great. I was the star. Everyone was looking at me. You know, I was bit by the bug, and so I wasn't about to take any small parts after that. I mean, I played Jesus. So where do you go from there? But I continued to do a lot of my early theater work in the church, and I mentioned that in part because I think for me, theater has always been, again, I've journeyed on the religious path to going to church, not going to church, being religious on my own, not being religious at all. But for me, I think getting a start in theater and church really helped me understand the power of the medium, which I think is an art form that is collaborative. You have to get a lot of different people with a lot of different points of view in a room, and you become stronger because of that. The focus is always on the audience and the message that they leave with. So hopefully you're doing something that's trying to inspire thought. I teach a little bit now. I try to do it less and less. The pandemic has, kids today are just, I'm old now when I say things like kids today, they don't know what they're, But the pandemic has had a huge effect on kids, so I'm kind of backing away from teaching a little bit. But, I talk about what is good theater, and good theater for me is theater that changes the way that you're breathing. So breath is our life force. We stop breathing, we stop living. So, I teach because I want to see better theater in the world. I see a lot of theater where I walk out and I think, well, that was 2 hours of my time, and but it didn't really challenge me to think outside the box. And as I got older and continued to do theater, I found that being an actor wasn't enough, because being an actor, you get hired to do a gig, you don't pick the play, you don't pick what role you even get sometimes, and so it's pretty limiting the impact that you can have as an actor, just in terms of what stories you tell and what stories your body is used to tell. And so as I, pursued theater professionally, I just kind of got a little bored by the stories I was being asked to tell, and I thought there's more stories that I want to tell. A little bit about my background. My dad's from Venezuela. He came to this country when he was 11, and so I am half Venezuelan. My mom is white, from a farm town in Indiana. I'm Southern. I grew up in Georgia my entire life, from some really, really small towns. The first play that I wrote was actually about the small town that I grew up in. It's called Prison Town, mostly because the small town that I grew up in, although it felt like a prison at times when I was there, literally right now it's home to one of the nation's largest immigration detention centers. Wherever you stand on immigration, and I think it's a hot button issue in the world right now, the reality is that a lot of the people who end up there have not committed any crime, and yet they are treated like criminals. And the number of people who are kept in solitary confinement and the length of time that they're kept there is really atrocious. The UN says anything over 15 days in solitary confinement is technically torture and can have long-term psychological damage and effects. That was sort of my jumping off point. And while I sit here as, someone who sounds like an obvious liberal, and went into writing that piece with that sort of bent of like, how can we let this happen? What was fascinating to me was I got some money from a local organization to start doing research for this piece, which I thought was going to be this one thing. And what I ended up finding was, when I went down to the town and I started talking to the people that I grew up with that are now working in this detention center, what I found was that they were still the same people that I remembered and still the same people that I loved. But these were the only jobs that they could get. It wasn't just the people who were being held in an immigration detention center that were trapped there, it was also the people in the town. Like many small towns, industry had died out, there were no real jobs, home values had plummeted, the schools weren't well invested in, and so the best job that they could get with benefits full-time was in the detention center. And they were as affected, I won't say as affected because I don't think watching someone be tortured and being tortured is the same thing, but they were also affected by this system. And so the play became how do we, as the theater-going audience, which is a lot more cosmopolitan and I think oftentimes much wealthier and much more educated than the people in this town in particular, how easy it is for us to not see these people, both the people who are being detained and the people who are forced to work these jobs that we are not because of our position in the world. And that became the central call of that piece, is just asking people to see people that otherwise it's very easy not to see. Which kind of gets to this, one of my big impulses in the work that I create is how are we queering the world that we live in? And that has nothing to do with sexuality. I am queer, I'm a queer man, but when I use the word queer, for me, that really is about how do we move past a binary. Again, all this sounds like very political language, but I mean it in a very simple way. I think we are living in a polarized environment. Even talking about a binary like gender puts people on the defensive, puts people in the like, this is what I believe, and I'm gonna fight for this till the end of the, till I die, as opposed to sitting across from someone that they may have a different opinion from and being able to listen and to hear and to see that maybe there is a spectrum. My work is really about, if you are fixed in one point of view, you probably don't have the full picture. So how can we move into a world where we're looking at the world as a spectrum and where we can try and find common ground? That gets me to the play that I'm working on while I'm here. There are a couple of other plays in there we can talk about, but the play that I'm working on here is actually quite appropriate that we started this conversation before you all arrived, talking about bathrooms and plumbing, because the play that I wrote is about bathrooms in public parks in St. Louis and the men who meet there to have sex. In 1968, Laud Humphreys, who was also a callback to church and to the ministry, he began his career as an Episcopal minister. He worked mostly in Oklahoma and Kansas. When he was coming up, he was very dedicated to civil rights and cared passionately about that struggle. He preached to overwhelmingly white and wealthy Episcopalians about civil rights. That did not go over well. One day, a couple of vestry members came to his church to look for him. His wife, who was pregnant at the time, was home. He was not. They didn't believe her when she told them that he wasn't there. They knocked open the door, knocked her to the ground. She lost the baby and was never able to get pregnant again. He lost his faith to a certain extent. He said, all the work that I've been trying to do using this Bible to teach people that people are the same hasn't worked. It seems like the more I preach this, the more set people become in their ways. So how do I leave the church and look for another place where maybe the answers that I was seeking in the Bible, maybe that's not the path I should be on. Maybe I should be on a path asking questions. And so he went into academia, a place where, allegedly we ask questions. I think, again, that's something that's become contested today. Before I talk about his research, I think, the moment that this play takes place is 1965 to 1968. And especially being here in this place for the last 2 weeks has been fascinating in that regard, because in 1968, the final year of the play, there was a major presidential candidate who decided that he should not continue his campaign. Sounds kind of familiar. There was a contested big open convention that people were protesting outside of. Doesn't look like that part of history is going to repeat itself. It seems like we're pretty locked into a candidate on the Democratic side. But you are having major uprisings in the country around race. You're having a huge anti-war movement, and lots of students on campuses are upset because of the war that's going on. I mean, the parallels between 1968 and 2024 are pretty remarkable when you stop to sort of think about what was going on. So, I mean, as I've been here this week and as the national events have played out in the way that they have, it's been really fascinating to sort of see those reflections. There's also a time when women's rights and the rights of gay men, homosexuals, were starting to bubble up. Women's rights had been bubbling up for a while, but this is Equal Rights Amendment time. But the rights of gay men really weren't being talked about in a major way. 1968 is just before Stonewall. Stonewall happened in 1969. The first Pride was held in 1970. 1969 is also when homosexuality was taken out of the medical books as a diagnosable illness, mental illness, which is what it was thought of at the time. So this was before that, when it was still categorized as a mental illness and still very much something that people were arrested for, and something that was very clandestine, especially in a place like St. Louis, which was a good Catholic Midwestern town. I first found out about Laud Humphreys' work because I went to Washington University in St. Louis. That's the full title now. Back when Laud was there, it was just Washington University. They didn't feel the need to explain exactly where it was. But now that's the trademark name, Washington University in St. Louis. It's a mouthful and hard to print on sweatshirts, but they manage it. So we went to the same school, and in my time there and talking to people, I learned about his work. And what's fascinating about Laud Humphreys for me, on one level, is just the fact that this is someone who is important in queer history that most people don't know about. But that's not super surprising because we aren't taught queer history. We are in the past 10 years have kind of, Alan Turing has had a movie made about him, but if you're asking people, and Harvey Milk over the past 20 years has sort of risen up as a figure that is sort of nationally known. But there are very few people who are queer who are known for their contributions. And it's not that they haven't made them, it's just that we just never learned that part of history. So that was part of what was interesting to me. I think also this idea of talking about things that we don't talk about, and sex for everyone. I think we just grow up in a world where we don't talk about our sex lives, and we don't really interrogate our sex lives. And to have that sort of front and center in his work in 1968, even today, it feels like a shocking thing to do. So Laud Humphreys was searching around for a dissertation topic, and in real life, he had written several papers about homosexuality. It was kind of known, interestingly enough, in his seminary class that he was gay and identified as gay, but he later fell in love with a woman and married her. As I mentioned, they married when he was a priest in Oklahoma. After she lost the baby, they did adopt 2 children, and they moved to St. Louis for him to pursue his master's and PhD at St. Louis with 2 children. So the play is really tracking, with some changes for dramatic sake, the writing of this dissertation. So what's fascinating, again, to some people about Laud is the fact that he was studying homosexuality at all. And what he did for his research was he discovered by reading the paper that people were getting arrested for public indecency when they were in the bathrooms in Forest Park. Forest Park is 3 times the size of Central Park. It's right in front of Washington University. It's like literally in its front yard. And there were certain restrooms that men would drive to off the beaten path. The zoo is there, the art museum is there, the history museum is there. Like, there are lots of people in Forest Park, but it's big enough that there are some secluded pockets. So the men would go there, and then outside there would be sort of a silent negotiation. Maybe a guy's waiting there, maybe another guy shows up. There's almost a silent dance that happens between the 2 men that, yes, you're here for the same thing I am. Great. Okay, we're going to go inside and we're going to see what happens. So Laud, in reading about the arrest, found out about it and then started to go to visit. And one of the reasons he wanted to visit was the fact that these men were getting arrested. And he thought, okay, how are these men getting arrested, and why are the police spending resources in a time when there's enough going on in the world? It seems like they should have better things to do than hang out in the bathroom and look out for men, But the reasoning by the police was that these men were dangerous to society. They were spreading diseases, they were entrapping children. So the same old myths that have been around about homosexuals since forever. We have horns, we have teeth, we're all pedophiles, and we eat the children after we molest them, right? And so they had to be stopped. Easy target. And so the police were going, sometimes actually entrapping the men, sometimes, getting bribes from these men. And it seemed like a terrible waste of resources to Laud. And also, he wanted to sort of prove that the men that were going there were not what people actually thought. In the play, and this is kind of a manufacture, but to sort of add another dimension to it, Laud also, his hypothesis about it is that as opposed to being this detriment to society, a place that's, this terrible place of sin and inequity, it's actually a rehearsal room for greater equality in the world. Because what was really fascinating about these spaces was that it was one of the few integrated spaces at the time. And not only racially integrated, and this is the 60s, so they were definitely, Laud had an FBI file in part because he showed up to a restaurant with black friends, other clergymen, and the owner asked them all to leave. And that was the start of an FBI file that got thicker over the years because of several other things that he did throughout his life. So there were integrated spaces to some extent, but the level of integration was not just racial, it was age. So people were having sex with people that were vastly different ages than they were. They were coupling with people who were different economic classes than they were. The tea rooms themselves were this kind of unique mixing pot. And he thought that maybe what the men did inside would affect their behavior outside. At least that's the invention that is for the play. Of course, his mentor points out people have had sex with people of different classes and races since time immemorial. It doesn't mean that the slave or the person who owned enslaved people actually freed them afterwards. It just means, convenience, power, a lot of things were going on. But Laud had hope that this was different. This was consensual. Men were meeting together. They were erasing these lines that were so fixed outside, and maybe this was a rehearsal room for something much, much bigger. So he goes to the rooms, and he's observing. His wife is an actress. She works in community theater mostly. This is true. Nancy was a 6-foot-tall community theater actor. And so he starts to notate, like you would if you're an actor. He draws the tea room like it's a stage, and then he's got these great papers that are now at University of Southern California where he writes down notes on every interaction. So it's got X, who's the person who inserts, and Y. Most of the sex was oral or masturbation. So right off the bat, he noticed all the stuff about diseases passing is really not true. Much lower transmission if you have oral or if it's masturbation. So he was noting X is the person who inserts, Y is the person who receives, and he would draw these drawings. You can see them online on the archive of University of Southern California. And write down as much detail as he could. He would say, this person was wearing a blue polo shirt and really nice checkered pants. He drove a red Mustang, 1963. He would write down as much detail as he could about each interaction. And somewhere between 60 and 100 different acts involving multiple people and sometimes multiple people at once. And so he has all this information in these sheets, but that doesn't tell him anything about who these men are outside of the tea rooms. And they're called tea rooms, by the way, because it's British slang. Tea is urine in Britain, and so it's called tea rooms, became the slang, just like bathrooms. You don't really bathe in bathrooms. You don't really rest in restrooms. You don't, So anyway, that became the word. I don't know why it was a British slang, but people in the know would call them tea rooms. So he has all this information on what goes on in the tea rooms, but he doesn't have any information about who they are outside. And that's the whole thing about his hypothesis. He wants to prove that these people in their real lives are not who we think they are. So how does he solve that problem? At one point during this, he gets arrested. They do a raid on the tea rooms while he's there. He gets arrested. He has a friend on the police, so he gets out okay. He's like, I'm here for research. They let him out. But as he's trying to figure out how he can find out more information, the idea comes to him that, I have a friend on the police. And I can write down the license plates of all the men who come to the tea rooms. And I can go to my friend on the police and I can hand him this list of license plates, and he can give me the addresses and names of the people that these cars are registered to. Huge violation of ethics. At this point, there are no internal review boards who if you do human research, you have to go before these IRBs and they approve your research. people say that was in part developed because of this work, but so you think about it, the men have not consented to be observed. They think that he's just there hanging out doing the same thing that they are doing. And not only is he observing them without their consent, he has now taken their license plates and given them to the very people that are hunting them. He swears that this friend is not going to get, not going to give them to the other police officers, and he's just doing him a favor. He writes them all down in a book. He keeps the book in a security deposit box. He's trying to keep it as safe as he possibly can, but it's already a huge violation. More so, he waits a year until after he stops going to the tea rooms, and he shows up to the men's houses in disguise. And what was his disguise? It was like a pair of glasses, a trench coat, and a hat. I mean, he had to look like Inspector Clouseau, like it's just kind of like, what in the world is going on?
Too many movies.
At the time, he was working for a professor giving out who had a demographic survey. So he asked this professor, he said, hey, I have like 50 names that he pulled at random from the license plates that he'd gotten. Is it okay if I include them in the study? And he's like, sure, yeah. So he shows up to these men's houses to give them this demographic study, because he hadn't really been able to talk to many of them outside of the tea rooms. The tea rooms were almost all silent. He said the conversations he heard involved people at the end, after they'd finished, they'd say something like, thanks. Or one time someone whispered, he's got an 18-inch cock. And he made a notation. It's in one of his observation sheets. He was like, he didn't really, it was maybe 9 or 10 inches. And I was like, the detail that he put in there. But he goes to their houses in costume, and he interviews these men right alongside their wives. And the thought is, like, I'm in disguise, they're not going to recognize me. But, like, if you have been going to this illicit place for, and there are regulars, the same guys who are showing up, I'm sure they knew who he was. But if they're in front of their wives, they're not going to give any indication that they know who he is. And through that research, he found out that there were basically he classified the men that he interviewed in 4 different types. The first type was, there were working class men, mostly Catholic. They had like 5 or 6 kids at home. Their wives did not use birth control. The pill had just come out in about 1961, but Catholic women would not use birth control. And so basically these were the guys who after work were like, the last thing I want is my wife to have another kid, and she doesn't want to, so my option, if I don't want to take care of it myself, is to go and have this guy take care of it. They did not identify as homosexual, type 1. In fact, 53% of the men who were interviewed showed no outward appearance of identifying at all as homosexual. So the majority of the men that were visiting, we at that time would not classify as homosexual. Type 1, working class, looking for an easy way to get off. Type 2 were probably, he called them ambisexual. We would probably use the term bisexual today. A lot of them were married, but professed in some of the conversations that he had outside of the tea rooms to being highly sexual. They had high sex drives. They had great sex lives with their wives, but they wanted something different and wanted something more. And so these were oftentimes the more affluent men. They were able to bribe their way out of police interactions. They were also some of the highest sort of in society at the time. They were, again, members of vestry at the cathedrals. They were businessmen. They were, prominent members of the community. Type 3 were openly gay men. Sometimes they were younger men who were coming to the tea rooms to look for older men who might take care of them, rent them an apartment, put them up somewhere nice. Or they were people who were in homosexual relationships but kind of bored and looking for something different to do. Or, I think that was mostly type 3. And then type 4 were closeted gay men. So they were open, they were, to themselves, they were gay, but they could never be in a relationship because of family stigma, religious stigma, work stigma. So this was their only out. Those were the most maladjusted and sort of depressed, anxious individuals. So that was sort of the 4 types. He wrote his dissertation. There was, the way it was received on campus was mixed and to no big surprise. His mentor was a big, sociology needs to be in the field, doing the work of the people, like with an agenda to like really, you know, be out there and making a difference in the world as much as possible. And there was another professor named Alvin Gouldner who was like, sociology can only be respected if it is as rigorous as any other hard science. We have to maintain an objective distance. We should study human systems, like systems of government, from a cold distance in our ivory towers. So these men butted heads a lot. Laud was obviously sided with Lee. Laud and Alvin hated each other, and they are to the point where in 1968, as all of this was going on and Alvin was just getting more and more irate about it all, Laud drew a cartoon based on some like New Yorker cartoon comparing Laud to this really pompous bird. And he posted the cartoon all over the department and all over the campus. And Alvin got irate. He came into Laud's office and he beat the crap out of him. He sent Laud to the ER. So like, it's just like, not only is this like happening in a really fraught time, but like Laud is just like pouring gasoline on the fire with his colleagues. Laud at the time was also applying to join the faculty of Washington University, aided in part by a $1.2 million grant that he got from the National Institute for Mental Health, in part because at this time they were really looking at studies involving homosexuals because they were at the point of decriminalizing and pathologizing homosexuality. So he gets this huge grant. He actually gets the job offer. Alvin, the other professor, they're like, hey, we're good. You can just do research on your own. You can never teach again. We're done with you. We're moving in this entirely new direction. That pisses off him. In the play, he's the one who tips off the papers. But basically, in about 1968, the papers get wind of what Laud has been up to, which of course goes about as you anticipate. Like, academics are like in our bathrooms looking at men diddling each other. They're wasting money on this. They just got all this government funding to watch men diddle each other. Isn't this terrible? The Board of Trustees, who at Washington University is some of the interestingly enough, like for whatever reason, St. Louis was a huge hub for, they do a lot of chemical work there. So Monsanto is based in St. Louis. They have a couple of other, like Agent Orange was basically like made in St. Louis. They're very pro-war. They're already upset about what's going on campus. All the Board of Trustees are like making millions off the war. They don't want these kids, half-dressed, banging tambourines on their campus, complaining about the work that they're doing. So when this comes out about Laud and what he's been up to, they're like, no. So they try to rescind the offer of employment for Laud, and they also try to deny him his PhD. So he's now at the point of graduating, and they try and deny it altogether, rescind his PhD. They have a big meeting. Ultimately, they decide you can't get your PhD, but you can't work here. And he goes on to an adjunct position later on. That's pretty much how the play ends with Laud's wife at this point, after finding out about his research, has taken the kids to her parents. Her parents get wind of what's going on, and they're like, yeah, we live in too small a town. You can't be here right now. So Laud ends up back home with his wife and kids, and it's just sort of not the happiest of endings. And that's kind of where the play ends. Laud eventually does come out in 1980. From 1980 to 1989, he lives with his partner out in Pomona, California. He teaches at I think Claremont, but I forget one of the sister schools there. His dissertation gets published in 1970. It's a pretty big deal. It wins a big award. Not very many dissertations get published. However, within his lifetime comes all the criticism about, hey, this research is interesting, but you're a terrible person. You never should have done it this way. This is like completely unethical. So Laud's reputation now, the way that his work gets taught, if it gets taught, and it does actually in a lot of sociology textbooks, it gets taught as an example of what not to do. But I think there's still value in recognizing the contribution that he made and how he proved that these men that we have called all the, every name but the children of God are our principals, and they're sitting next to us in church, and they are, sometimes our husbands. And how do we try and move this movement forward so that they don't have to, if they don't want to, act in in secrecy. But the play really is asking these questions, because in the play, Laud is also struggling with his sexuality. How are the things, the ultimate play, the question of the play, I think, is how are the things that we keep secret, trying to protect other people, or the things that we do and that we tell ourselves we're doing to help other people, how are those actually, doing more damage than by us not being honest. So, yeah, I talked a lot. That's what I've been working on.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So we'll open it up for questions. I'm very interested in your desire for community discussions about these, not this particular issue, but just issues that people, have a particular bent on the way they see things. How do you see that, working? How do you see, addressing that? I mean, I talked to Lee about Mother Road. Many of us saw that at Berkeley Rep, and I thought it was really good, but when I sat down with Lee, he gave me a whole different perspective.
Well, I think our conversation was really about looking at the issue of policing specifically, and Florence was generous enough to share her own experiences and having a son who was working in law enforcement. And I live in a neighborhood that is sort of, it's in a moment of transition. It was abandoned for a long time, and people are slowly starting to move back in. But a lot of the people that are living there currently are squatting. They are, a lot of addicts in the neighborhood, a lot of sex workers in the neighborhood, and one of the ways that they're trying to pull people back in is by offering affordable housing to police officers. So I live beside a police officer who I know, after offering to buy all my neighbors Harris for President signs, they were not chomping at the bit to get one. So I know that they are on a very different political, side of the fence than I am, and yet they take care of my dogs, and I know their family, and we are in each other's lives. I see them probably more often than I see almost anybody else. And so one of my responses to Mother Road was, it feels like the conversation that it's having around racism generally, but really policing specifically, is one in which liberals can pat themselves on the back of, like, isn't this terrible that police violence happens? Because it's a pretty central plot point of that piece. That isn't it terrible that, police violence happens, which I think we can all agree on, but how does that move the conversation forward? Because as we talked about, those same people are calling for more police officers in San Francisco, and they feel unsafe going downtown now. So I think I'm curious about how we can really have nuanced conversations. That said, the American theater right now is not set up for that. Just like literally, you walk in, you watch something silently, and you leave. One way that I have, and hopefully you're having conversations with the people that you came with, but it's not always guaranteed, and you're not always able to debrief, as we did, with someone that you may not know that well, and so it's a loss potential. I mean, I think what people are hungry for right now, as we become more and more digital and get lost in our devices, we want to connect with people and have experiences. I'm curious about how the theater can transition to create more space for that. One way that I've seen that done is a theater company that I worked for on staff and also as an actor is called Out of Hand Theater. They only do theater, the shows that they produce for the most part, the sort of more traditional shows that they produce, because they do several things, they're all done in homes like this. So this could literally be a setup for an Out of Hand show. They have their solo shows, they're an hour long, and after every single performance, they have a conversation. And they're all social justice based pieces. The one that I did it was pre-pandemic, so what was that, 1890? I don't know. It was on gun control issues, and it was in partnership with Moms Demand Action for gun sense in America. I can't remember exactly And what was fascinating about doing a play about gun control in Georgia is that everyone's got a gun. And so the conversation is not, should we have guns or should we not have guns? And it's not even really, should we have, and it is this to some extent, should we have this type of gun or should we not have this type of gun? A lot of the conversations that we ended up having is like, how do we actually talk about having guns, period, because we do and we don't talk about it, and how do we talk about having gun safety, and how do we talk about some of the impacts of having a gun in the house, because what people don't realize about gun violence is that the number one cause of gun violence is suicide, and more people die from gunshot wounds that are self-inflicted than they die from gunshot wounds from other people. That gets into a whole mental health crisis, and I think that oftentimes people are like, guns aren't the problem, mental health is the problem. It takes us down a side road that I'm not sure is helpful. What I would say is that access to weapons, as we have seen in the past month with the assassination attempt, if you have access to a weapon, you have an ability to use it in a way that maybe the person who bought the weapon didn't intend. And so I think that is how do we again have a nuanced conversation about some of these issues? But we've got to create space for it, which right now the theater hasn't done a great job of doing. So I'm hopeful that that changes. But
well, you know, a lot of theaters have talkbacks after a play, but they don't necessarily deal with an issue. They deal with the play, and if that makes sense.
yeah, and I'm more interested. You know, I have done plenty of talkbacks as an actor, and you know, inevitably get asked, how did you memorize all of those lines?
That's the
You
first
know,
thing.
it's like,
That's the first thing they ask.
okay, well,
Yeah.
and I'm so much
What
less.
you want to talk about?
Well, I know, and I'm like, I have just talked for, you know, especially in some of the one-person shows that I've done, like 90 minutes at you. You don't want to hear anything more from me. I'm more interested in conversations between the person you just witnessed this with, you know. And so, how do we have a talk back that's not about the makers of the piece, but about your experience? Because ultimately, that's so much more interesting. Like, sure, the person who made it had this intent, but what did you get out of it, and how is that different from the person that's sitting next to you, and where does that make your mind go? So,
One of the major problems that I've seen with talkbacks is that usually the talker back wants to talk
yeah,
and not very little insights, very little good questions, and it's just that, look what I know, and you get that maybe of 2/3 of the back talk. Now the other problem here in the Bay Area is you get very one-sided theater.
yeah,
You do not get diversity of theater in the Bay Area, and you know, if you tried, there'd probably be as much outrage as there was over the so-called Last Supper
yeah.
thing in the Paris thing. So it's almost impossible to find the breadth of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, how do we create theater that's actually about an issue that, you know, you're trying to hold both and give space for that dialogue.
If they wanted to do something radical here, the thing to do was something that would scare the shit out of somebody here, politically or otherwise,
Yeah,
and then get a conversation around that, as opposed to, you know, are the police brutal? Yes, some are, and you know, we can
Yeah.
go on from there.
So what if, as a writer, like when I read all the in O'Neill's plays, all his heavy details and set, what if as a writer you included in your play those follow-up questions, like give the material for those of us to then facilitate how we can hold follow-up conversations.
yeah.
That would help us understand too what sensitive topics you want us to address. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. Like, just sort of be like, if you want to produce my play, you've got to,
engage the audience in, you know, I don't know. Anyway.
yeah, it's a great idea. Like, and I think, you know, more and more we are seeing work that involves, you know, engages people, even something like Sleep No More, which doesn't necessarily require a lot, like, intellectually of the audience, but you're literally moving through. I mean, I think people are starting to think about theater in newer ways, especially as, like, we don't need to go see something that could just as easily be on Netflix, because we have Netflix and Netflix has more money and it's going to be better. So like, how do we embrace what is possible in a live theater that isn't possible somewhere else?
So how are you doing that in your play?
So I think the one way that I'm doing it, and I'm sure I could do it in more ways, is really thinking about dance. So between the sort of the scripted scenes, we really get to sort of enter into the way that Laud experiences the tea rooms. And so those are done with these really sort of, there are sections of the play that are just silent, or will maybe have some underscoring in terms of music, but there's no dialogue. And we really get to watch two bodies, or sometimes more depending on how many people are in the tea room, but really like, how are they finding each other, and how do we see that sort of like, it really is a sensual dance that happens between these two strangers as they're coming together, as maybe two on the nose, but as they're finding each other in these spaces. And I think it's just a reminder of, hopefully, if it's done well, that we have bodies and we are not just living up here. We have a full humanity, and I think that, at least in the play, is one thing that attracts Laud to these places. I mean, it is in this place that seems really profane. It's where we go to evacuate our bowels and our bladders. It's this bathroom, it's a public bathroom. It's a gross place, and yet he's able to find a beauty in the way that these men are finding each other. And I think there is a tenderness to it. There's also a brutality to the way, but like a visceral, necessary brutality. Just the embodiment of those acts, I think, breaks us out of this. And watching that live is different than watching it on a screen. And the time that it takes to actually move through that dance in a way that feels honest, because it does take time to make sure that we're on the same page, that this is what we want.
Well, that could be the same as a heterosexual relationship too, developing.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
you look at the way that sort of, you look at kids today that are growing up with access to porn at 9 years old, and you're like, that is your introduction to what sex is, and it's brutal. It's just, it's brutal. So how do we, reinvestigate that tenderness that happens, when you're trying to learn, actually listen from a body point of view. I mean, I think, how do we get people to listen, is and listen with their whole bodies.
Are you going to incorporate that motion, that physical dance, in the conversations of the Laud and the husband-wife in the interview portion, or is that not in your play?
And so say that one more time.
You described in his research how after taking all the details down from the tea rooms, that he found that visited them in their home in costume, and met with usually a husband and wife. And will there be dance incorporated in that dialogue?
I don't know. So right now there's one interview that's in it, and it's actually, the scene is a split interview. So it's Laud interviewing for the job at the same time that he's interviewing the man in the home. So he's being asked these questions about what he'd be like to work with, and like as a, how is he going to be a team member? And we've just seen him be a terrible team member, and sort of, and literally pick fights with, with people on staff, on his other colleagues. So as we're watching this man completely, essentially lie in front of us and say that he doesn't believe in integration, even though this is a man who has, been very intimate with people of another race, and he doesn't, believe in, he thinks that people who are anti-war are pinko commie faggots, and he's like using all this language that is not who we know him to be. Laud is also at the same time saying things that we know are not true. And so it's sort of that mirror is the dance of that is a verbal dance of watching Laud become the thing that he allegedly thinks is hypocritical.
And that was his real life. I mean,
It was his real
the
life.
reality was he
Yeah.
was that person.
Yeah.
And that's actually a really good way of
The term that he coined in his dissertation was called the breastplate of righteousness. And it's such a great term because to me, you're carrying around this heavy armor that's meant to say, no one will look at me if I just am so rigid in the way that I view the world. You know, if I'm deflecting all these questions about, no, that's terrible and you shouldn't do that and people who do that are terrible, then they won't look at me. But the reality of wearing body armor is that it's exhausting. And so at what point are you so exhausted that it paralyzes you because you can't move under the weight of that righteousness and that breastplate and that armor that you put on every day? And I think, we all do that to a certain extent. We all have masks that we wear. We all have, especially if we think about all the different people that we are, all the different versions of ourselves to, I know that when I'm going to this family member's house, I've got to wear this mask because I can't be who I really am around this person. I think it's very universal.
O'Neill would agree.
Yes. The mask.
So how far have you got with the playing? Did you achieve a lot at Tao House?
I did, yeah. So I came in with the first half pretty developed, and I have a second half now written. So I have a complete first draft that I've sent out to some friends that I'm starting to get feedback, friends and colleagues, and starting to get feedback from. I think, there's still definitely work to be done, and it feels like writing to me is like the block of marble where you're like, okay, I now see the shape of the body, but there's still some chiseling out to do. But it's been really, really fruitful. I now feel like I have a solid draft that I can actually go back and really start to get detailed in the tinkering. And
Sounds like a huge project.
it's I don't know. I the funny thing about writing, and I'm sure other writers may have said this, but you spend all this time and you feel a bit insane because I'm spending all this time writing this, and it could never leave my computer. I could just sit on my computer, or maybe the 10 people who read it will be the audience members for it. You just never know. It was very actually encouraging when I did the tour the second time. So I went and did it with Nico. And at the end, they had the list of O'Neill's plays. And there are 87 plays on, I don't know how many, but
51?
52.
52.
52. And if you ask even a really, big O'Neill fan to list off the plays of O'Neill, they can name 6 maybe,
Right.
maybe 7.
Right.
And it's just so encouraging to see all these plays that no one cares about. And maybe never, and some of them who they got published in 75, long after he had passed. It's just encouraging to be this is part of the process, is you have the story and you have to get it out. And everything that you do, I believe, will serve you somehow. This relationship may end up in a different play, in a different form. This dialogue, this idea may get used later, but not everything you do is gonna get produced. And so sometimes it makes you feel a bit insane to spend that much time doing it, but you have to believe that it will feed.
Well, I sort of decided, I thought Lord had to do something with England, but
it did.
It
This
did.
is what's fascinating is so as we're talking about trying to with the mask that we wear, he was named Robert by his father, but he had a really terrible relationship with his father. This is too much for the play because it's you don't believe it when it's too on the nose. But Laud found out after his father died that his father was gay. And he'd always wondered why he kept going down to Mardi Gras every year for these trips without the family. And then everyone's well, I want to go to Mardi Gras. He had he had 2 other brothers. And he found out it's in part that was when his father allowed himself to explore that part of his life. But he was so angry at his father that when he went to seminary and he had grown up, I think Methodist, but he became Episcopalian, and he was rebaptized in the Episcopal faith, even though they're like, we're Episcopals, you don't need to be rebaptized. Like, you're fine, you've been baptized, you're good. He's like, no, I want to be rebaptized and I want to change my name. And he chose the name Laud from William Laud, who was a Bishop of Canterbury, who was executed for his some of his political machinations. So it's a strange name to pick, but basically the high church, if you are Episcopalian, you know that they're Catholic light, they have high church, and William Laud is the man who's really responsible for that kind of theatricality. So he chose that name, but it was his own choosing. He was not named that as a child. Another reinvention.
So structurally, what does a play look like, and how many characters do you
That's
have?
my question.
So there
too.
are 5, is that right? So it's Laud, his wife Nancy, Lee Rainwater, who was his mentor, Alvin Goldner, who's this other professor who's got a very different view, and then a character named Ducky, who is a complete invention, but Ducky is a young black man who he meets in the tea rooms and eventually has a relationship with outside of the tea rooms. But that gives us the pull between this person that he could be, this person that he almost allows himself to be in this part of town where no one knows him and he can almost reinvent himself. And Ducky is this person who, because he can't pass in the way that Laud can, very effeminate, and walking through the world as a black queer man, has to embrace his identity. He doesn't have the opportunity of passing that Laud has, and so they get to have some conversations about what freedom actually looks like. Is freedom the ability to pass and to have a wife and to be able to have a good job and to be respected in society and then just do this on the side? Or is freedom saying, I don't need any of those things and I live my truth all the time, even if that means I live in a shitty apartment and work a shitty job? So what does freedom actually look like? But the structure of the play is basically, the first act is him finding out, deciding what to do his dissertation on, all the way up to the point where he decides to call his cop friend and get license plate numbers out. And then the second half is sort of the devolving of his life after he makes that decision. So, yeah.
I think it sounds incredible, first of all. Doing your research, and he went in and interviewed these men that he had followed. Were they receptive? They allowed him in their home, and was it sort of like them getting something off their chest, or?
It's really confusing. I think that's one thing. He doesn't really go into great detail in his dissertation and in the biography that I read of him, because there's one biography that was written, it's kind of strange that he even has a biography, and the biography is kind of not really well written. It's like a popular biography. It's pretty thin. Because he's not this notable, figure in sociology. They mention that in the preface that this is a strange biography to be writing, because normally if you're going to write about an academic, it's a major, it's an Einstein or it's an Oppenheimer. It's not like Laud Humphreys, this guy who wrote one book and then kind of never did anything again. So there's not a lot of information about what happened in those actual interviews, but it's this game, right, of maybe I don't immediately recognize you, or if I do immediately recognize you, you have to imagine that these are men who lived in the world. And so it wasn't completely unheard of to see the guy that you just, did whatever with in the bathroom, bagging your groceries at the grocery store. I have to imagine that when you're living this double life, you come across people and you just kind of both, maybe you nod or you don't nod, or you look, honey, actually I forgot something in the car, I'm gonna go, you exit the situation. So when someone shows up at your house, I think maybe there's, a bit of a demographic survey, okay, that sounds legit, and but I think what's fun to imagine about that is that tension of
Exactly.
do I recognize you? And
if it hits you mid-conversation.
yeah, or even if your wife is this guy just showed up, he wants to interview us, and you walk into the living room and you're like,
Us.
okay, it lends itself to theatricality, I think.
Definitely. But that's not in your play. You don't
It is.
have.
There is an interview.
Well,
Yeah,
there
yeah, yeah.
is.
There is an interview where we get to see someone. This man that Laud had hoped would have a more liberal, and I don't mean the word liberal. That I don't think that's really at the end of the day a more progressive. You know, in terms of like racial politics, in terms of economic politics, a more open mind about things ends up at least performing in front of his wife in the audience a much more closed-minded view that
Yeah.
is contrary to what he did in private.
Interesting.
Have you considered doing teaching? Now you said that you've put that aside, but teaching at another level where you could, I mean, you're so articulate and knowledgeable, clearly, that the things that are really important to you and the things that you do want to teach, you could get that. There would be an audience for that. And I know what you're
Yeah.
saying about kids.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean,
my
yeah.
daughter teaches at a community college, and she is experiencing that
It's
accountability issue.
Yeah, I mean,
You know,
like,
it's just
showing up on time
everybody's
is no
making
longer-
excuses for you, so I don't really have to do this, you know, that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
I'm curious about if you thought taking it to a different level, university level, or
Yeah, I've taught at universities, and much like in the play, I found like the politics are a bit like So it's funny. How I make my money in the world. I'm an actor full time, so mostly that means for the past few years it's been a lot of audiobooks. So I record audiobooks. I have a home studio. I say all this. I also do television. I've been fortunate. I'm on a television show right now. We're on a break right now, and well, they're filming right now, but I'm not in this episode. But I'm in like at least six episodes this season. That pays really well. It's great. It allows me time to write. But I say all this to say, I don't really work with other people. Like I joke and say like I have one employee. He's super lazy. He never wants to work. I have to like yell at him to like, you know, and it's me, you know, like, and so I'm like, I'd rather nap than record this book. But I have a hard enough time managing me. I think dealing with the politics of universities, which have become even more fraught of late. I mean, Emory University was one of the biggest ones in the news, at least in regionally. It was up there, you know, with Columbia and Harvard and, you know, UCLA. In terms of the protests and how divided that campus is. We have a huge Jewish population in Atlanta and a huge Jewish population at Emory in particular, and even within the Jewish population there, it was completely divided about how people felt about things. And so there's just a lot of, I have friends that teach, and there's a lot of politics there. I am in talks right now with the Alliance Theater, which is the big Lord Theater in Atlanta, about doing a seminar for directors and really thinking about how we can, in Atlanta, theater tends to be very naturalistic, a lot of like what we call kitchen sink sets where you're like, oh, it's a kitchen. And immediately when I walk into the set, I know exactly what story we're about to see, and there's no surprises, and my breath doesn't change at all, and it's not, you know. So it's a seminar that's going to be about how do we sort of, again, embrace the parts of theater that are unique to us. So that might be in my future. I'm in talks with the artistic director, one of the artistic directors, they have two right now, about bringing that. But I think, you know, a lot of the ideas that I have, I try and put in my writing, and that, yeah, but it's nice to have a chance to, like, you know, talk, you know, about ideas. It's not something that, yeah, we get to do often.
What show are you on?
What's that?
What show?
So I don't think it's so funny. I say this, like, I should not say this is a terrible thing for me to say, but I'm like, no one watches it. That's not true, actually. Like 43 million people watch it. Blah blah blah. It's found on NBC. It's network television. So I'm not the demographic. Yeah. No, it's so funny. I mean, the Nielsen ratings came out. It's like I say 43 million. It's not 43 million. It's the 43rd most watched show on television of all television. Tracker on CBS was the number one. Monday Night Football or whatever, Sunday Night Football was like number 2. But they tracked all the TV, and Found was number 43, which is like respectable. But it's a new show on NBC. It premiered like basically January of 2023, and then because of the actor strike, we kind of had a weird gap. So it'll premiere again in the fall.
How do you face the problem that the overwhelming majority of theater goers want to see musicals and not plays?
It's a huge problem, and I think. I mean, so do I sometimes. You know, like I love a good musical.
Escapism.
I think,
Yes.
yeah, and I think it's again like I don't want to be a victim blamer and say that it's the theater's fault, but like the theater that I see the straight plays that I see haven't been super compelling. And listening to someone sing, I love music. Like it's just like innately more
Involving.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, in terms of, again, like this, if this is our metric of like changing breath, like when you see someone belting their face off in front of you, even in something as silly as like, what is it, the Heart of Rock and Roll that was just on Broadway. I had a friend in that. It's the Huey Lewis in the News, like it's hard with that singing and dancing to not feel something, to have your breath changed. And so for straight theater, I think, how do we surprise people? Where's the rigor? I was just literally, as I was pulling up here today, having a conversation with a friend who is doing Raisin in the Sun at a theater in Atlanta. And they have 2.5 weeks of rehearsal.
What?
It's a 3-hour play.
That's tight.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Boy.
the metaphor that I used is our soup isn't selling. Let's add more water and see if people will buy watery soup. And it just sort of seems like the model for a theater in America, and I mean the financial model for theater in America, isn't working. And it looks like it's only going to get worse in terms of, we really depend on donors to fund half of our season. The other half is covered by ticket sales and whatever revenue we can generate through the education department. The Alliance is doing well right now because their summer camps alone bring in $1 million profit. So for a $14 million theater, that's pretty good. But for the theaters that don't have a strong education department, don't have any other sources of earned revenue, it's really tricky. You're really dependent on your donors, and those donors are getting older.
Well, that's your theater. When you look out in the audience,
Yeah.
we used to call them Q-tips. The audience
There we
members
are.
are Q-tips.
Yeah, and we haven't.
Sorry, girls.
No, but what do we do to attract a younger audience, and how do we convince younger people to give? Again, I think we have to give them an experience and not a lecture. And a lot of theaters, unfortunately, feel really determined to continue to lecture us, and I'm like, this is not working. So
What do you think about, I was just thinking about, theater, as we know it in the US, is so commercialized, and, even when O'Neill was writing, he made most of his money, not off of his plays being produced. He made it off of people buying copies of it.
yeah,
Major income, and people read them. They were more interested in that because it was what it was, and nobody else was doing that. But if you remember the play in New York, Burn This, John Malkovich was the star. Understudy was Eric Roberts. I sound old. Eric Roberts was much better because he was believable beyond belief. It wasn't just, oh, I'm John Malkovich. He was really good. But here's a play that touches in, he has a gay experience or homosexual experience, how you would describe it in those days, in New York. And look how well that play did.
Yeah.
And it wasn't commercial. They didn't sing songs. They didn't do any of those things.
Yeah.
And people went there, and it was done in a way that educated people, and it made them, I say that, it made them feel comfortable with something that they weren't comfortable with.
Yeah.
Which is, it's like the difference of somebody having conversations versus shouting at you. Somebody shouting at you, you're not listening.
Yeah.
But when you have a conversation, you go, oh, I get that. But that, I think that was a really interesting example.
yeah.
That was very successful.
I think of the play Slave Play by Jeremy O'Harris that has done really well. It's on the West End right now, and it is controversial. No one in that goes to see that play and is comfortable. Like everyone is like, this is if you don't know, this is a bit of a spoiler, but you find out pretty quickly. You go in, and there are people who are dressed like they are enslaved, and then there are white people that they're interacting with, and you think, like, is this a period piece? You find out that it's these interracial couples that are all at a couples retreat where they are engaging in, like, the black person in the partnership is pretending to be enslaved, and their white partner is pretending to have power over them, to explore the power dynamics in their sexual relationship. And it's a whole, like, couples therapy weekend that they have signed up for in this really high pressure way of, like, we're actually going to talk about what's at the root, you know, of an interracial relationship by, like, sort of pushing into the power extremes. Super controversial, super, like, in your face, but not in a way that's, like, lecturing you, but you're like, oh, what's gonna happen? And it's done really well and gotten people talking, and it became an event of, like, have you seen this? Have you seen this? What did you think? Oh my God, I hated it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop talking about it. So I think we have to think about, like, you know, how are you creating events of, like, oh my God, I saw this play where, you know, talked about this thing that we don't talk about, you know. I think that is a key of doing it. But I think it's just about surprising people. It feels like, you know, we keep getting plays that people think we want, you know. And I think I listened to a podcast. Maybe I'm blanking on the name right now. He writes for the New York Times. I'm blanking right now, but basically he had a podcast that was about how algorithms have limited our taste. So right now, if you go to Netflix or if you're on Spotify, even, like, the way that our news has become so segmented, you either are a Fox News person, or you're a CNN person, you're a Wall Street Journal person, or you're a New York Times person, or, you know, we have become more and more segregated in the way that we receive our media, and it just is making our tastes more and more limited. The algorithm will continue to feed us more of what it thinks we want. And so we're not even aware of, like, oh, there's this new artist that you would really like, but because it's not something you've listened to before, you may not ever hear it, because the algorithm keeps feeding us more of what it thinks we
You
want.
like what you eat, and you eat what you like.
Yeah.
And it stops. And, you know,
That is
I
so
apologize.
scary.
I have another thing.
Yes, no, but
It was really a pleasure to meet you. I can't wait to see this.
I
Yeah,
know.
hopefully
I mean,
it'll,
this
got a
is-
stage
I'm
news.
really interested in Prison Town too.
Yeah.
So Prison Town, did you end up did it perform, and what did you learn from that with edginess, especially in your community, that could influence how, you know?
Yeah, we
This could
performed
be
it this year. It
considered.
had its first production this year down in Savannah, this past summer, or early summer, and I learned it could probably be 30 minutes shorter, and that, you know, that in some ways it felt dated. It kind of felt like, it felt more in terms of exactly what we're talking about, in terms of, like, lecture-y more than, it's a one-person show, so it already kind of has, like, a tendency to feel lecture-y. So it was, I learned a lot. The audiences that came, there were some nights where, especially when we had younger people in the audience that were engaging in the humor of the piece, it felt really alive. And there were some nights where it felt like, you know, it was a smaller theater, it was half full some nights, and so it just kind of felt like we were all, we were like, yeah, can we just say we're not having fun? Like, this does not feel enthusiastically consensual anymore. Let's all go home. So
Have an intermission and not come back.
yeah, exactly. And I think part of that too is, like, I do have questions about how we are priming our audiences, because they had just done shortly before 39 Steps, which I don't know if you know that play, but it's like a wacky play, and it's like, you know, it's a lot of, like,
It's a riff on Hitchcock's movie on it.
yes, and so it's like lots of physical humor. It's very funny. It's very fast paced, and, like, my show could not be more different. Like, I like to think it's funny, but it's like a one person show. Like, so I think, how do we prepare our audiences for what they're about to see in our season planning? It's hard. So, yeah, we're gonna have another run at it, and it's gonna be performed with Out of Hand Theater, and not until spring of 26. But it'll be a shorter version that will be performed in homes, and I think
That'd be good for a home audience.
Yeah.
That's cool. And
That's a cool idea.
yeah, it's great.
It really is.
We'll bring one here. I'll come out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
I just
I
think
love
that's
that.
a great idea.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got some good intimate environments too, where it could be more.
I'll do it outside. I mean, the play ends. You know, it's again one of the. It's got you have the interviews with detainees. You've got interviews with guards, but then what's also fascinating is apart from the immigration center, right outside of town, and I went to it a lot. I was only there for the first 5 years of my life in that town, but we always used to go. There's two things that we always used to go to on the weekends. One was Westville. It was a living history museum, and the tagline was Westville, where it's always 1850.
Wow.
And it was a living history museum that did not mention slavery once.
Really?
Wow.
Really?
Oh my
Surprise,
goodness.
surprises. Even
So-
in the state of Florida.
And it, like the part in the play is me recounting to a black friend like why I keep going back to Lumpkin, and one of the reasons I was obsessed with it is like, you know, it's also that we had this weird thing in town. It wasn't always known for a prison; it was known for this, and I was super excited as I was telling her about it because people literally came from around the world. 50,000 people a year in the late 80s were going to Westville, and when I was a kid, they had the best gingerbread and lemonade. It was like, that's what I remember, and I'm telling her about this, and she's like, wait, Westville, where it's always 1850? What? And it wasn't until she like started to question this that I'm like, oh.
Oh, that's weird.
This thing that I've loved from child, you know, that I sort of have in this one place in my mind was this whole other thing going on. The other place that we went a lot was Providence Canyon. It's called the Little Grand Canyon, and it's really, really, it's just gorgeous. It was caused because of the monocropping. So they planted cotton year after year after year in the basically 1850 to 1880, and it destroyed the soil. So the ground actually opened up. It started with cracks, and then they grew into ravines with the rains, and then it ate a town. This canyon ate a town. One of the reasons that we have kudzu, especially in the south, is because this place, they were like, we've got to stop the erosion. We're going to bring in this plant from Japan called kudzu, and it's going to help stop the erosion, which, you know, it did, but then
did do that.
took
among
over.
other things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, of course.
it's this
Yeah.
beautiful place, but it was built. It was created by extraction, and I think one of the big themes of that play is just this extraction. How do we keep finding ourselves hoping that we can extract enough out of something that it'll, you know, without ever thinking about the long-term consequences of it. So even the prison itself, not only are we extracting the labor out of the detainees who are paid like $1 a day for their labor, they're literally cleaning the place and working in the kitchen, but the people who are going in as guards for $37,000 a year and just sort of leaving shells of who they are. So we live in an extractive society, and how do we sort of start to
I think it would be fascinating conversation.
yeah.
Got a great play title in the Canyon of Ada Town, though.
Oh yeah. Was that created by, I don't know, was that the
Now I just offered it for you.
yeah.
Yours.
Well, thank you so
So
much.
much.
Thank you for this experience. It's been like so rejuvenating. Not only have I had time to write, but I've gotten to be in this beautiful place and hike up the hill behind Tao House
yeah.
and go to Muir Woods and go into San Francisco and, you know, to the beach there. It's all beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You even went to MoMA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh God, it's
Yeah.
so great.
Yeah.
I'm so envious of your museums.